All right, looks like we're at time. Just give a few moments for people to log in because it takes a moment for Zoom to let everybody in, and then we'll get started. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So we have several people logged on already. My name is Chin Chun, and I'm with NACBA and the Consultants Training Institute. Before we get started with the Around the Valuation World today, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. First, to obtain CP credit, you must answer all the poll questions that pop up on your screen during today's webinar. CP surveys will be available on your nacba.com portal within 7 to 10 business days after the webcast. If you have any questions for our presenter today, please use the Q&A feature, as those will be directed to the presenter. If you have any technical questions or questions about NACBA, please use the chat feature, as those will be directed to me. All right, and those, we have Wolfgang Nies, Andrew Newman, and Pratik Shah, who are technical editors. Unfortunately, they're unable to join us today. So I'll be running the program today. Today we have Brady Finney, who will be discussing working capital analysis and projection challenges and inconsistencies. Let's see. So Brady coordinates on top running. You can see. Okay. Brady coordinates Atlantic Management's valuation advisory practice and has prepared or managed over 1,000 valuations spanning from startups to billion-dollar enterprise companies. Brady has over 20 years of experience in operations, financial strategy, technology consulting, and marketing. Prior to joining Atlantic Management Company, Brady managed the budget and analysis process for a 10 billion retail office chain supply chain, excuse me. Later, he became the director of operations for the New Orleans Technology Council, where he consulted with over 200 technology companies in their marketing strategies, strategic plan, and product delivery processes. Brady served as interim controller for a 40 million publicly held manufacturing company and raised over 8.5 billion in both angel and venture capital funding for a technology startup. And with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Brady. Oh, did we lose him? Hold on one second. Looks like we lost him, so let's see. One moment, my apologies for he was having a little technical issues. Hello, Brady, are you there? Brady, I believe you're on mute. Let's see. I see you on the phone as well. But you are muted. Are you able to unmute yourself? Looks like it's not. Give it a moment. He may be logging back in. Apologies for the delay. And looks like he's logging back in. Hello, Brady. Hello, Brady. Are you there? Oh, I see you. You are muted. able to unmute yourself? Let's see. You think your Bluetooth is connected with the microphone or Zoom? Yeah, we apologize for the technical issues. I was working earlier and I think he lost internet. So still can't hear you, Brady. Are you able to dial into another phone? Can you hear me, Brady? No, yes, if you can. Rose too. Still can't hear you.
What about now?
There we go. Yep, we can hear you now.
Hey, I'm really sorry, everybody. Traveling and lost internet connection once or twice. I've been on the other side of this, and I know it's irritating when we have kind of a short period here and we got to jump in. So, China, do you want to mind just maybe just jumping the slides here?
Yeah, let me share the screen real quick, and then let me know if you can see that.
I can, yes. So I'm just going to give the 20-second intro. I think everything that's written here is great, but just a quick background. I've been in Atlantic for about 20 years, and we do valuations for a number of different purposes. I'm assuming, like most people here, we do them for gift and estate, shareholder buyouts. We do some financial planning, that kind of thing. We do. It seems like lately we've done more and more shareholder disputes or shareholder buyouts and some spinouts of entities and some fairness opinions. And one of my, when I'm on a lot of these types of webinars, when we listened over the years, I sometimes feel like the presenters have like unlimited time to do their analysis. I mean, they talk about their analyses and it's like they have 1,000 hours budgeted for it. And I always kind of think to myself sometimes, like, do they have no budget? Do they have only one project they're doing this year? We do in our shop about 150 to 175 valuations in a given year. And we're under time pressure, right? So like I think probably a lot of you. So I just wanted to kind of frame that as that the way that we look at this. And Shiner, if you want to go to the next one. One of the other kind of pet peeves as I see these is that the topics usually are super broad and I don't get a lot out of them. Sometimes I do, but I always think to myself, like, I'd rather do a little bit deeper dive on a narrow topic than really broad on something, that's not that helpful. So really wanted to talk about how we calculate working capital, and I don't know that our way is the best way, and just how it all kind of fits together. Over the years, we've started asking a lot of people how they do it. We see a lot of transactions, so we see how it's done in a real transaction, but we also see other people's valuations, and we like talking about it. And I will tell you, I was just in Boston, and there was a big M&A conference, and somebody from one of the big M&A shops stood up, and he was talking about whatever subject he was talking about, but he threw out, and of course, then there's the working capital adjustment, which no one understands. And I kind of laughed to myself of, I've been doing this 20 years, and I feel like everybody else has it figured out. So anyway, I just want to jump in. We have probably another 40 minutes, so I just want to kind of get right to it. And definitely feel free to ask questions if we come back, if you want to email me separately after or whatever. I love talking about this, and working capital is one of my things at Atlantic. So if you want to jump to the next slide here. Let's just jump right into the agenda here. Don't need to walk through it. We'll go to first thing is the best methodology from our standpoint. We love, and I'll show it to you in a minute. We like looking at the 12-month average working capital, or maybe the 24-month average, and then comparing that to where we are. But you don't always have monthly financials. And I think, sometimes on smaller companies, and our valuations kind of span from maybe 2 million enterprise value companies to, 50 million is kind of the norm for us. And it's probably more like 25 million. We do several companies that are several hundred million. We got a couple of $1 billion clients, but we're like, in that normal range of companies. And if you're doing smaller companies in that 2, 3, 4 million range, they might only have tax returns, which we don't love, but sometimes you got to deal with what you have. So the methodology really might depend on what data you have. And that's really a driver for us. And then the second, and these are more kind of designed to help you think about maybe questions you want to ask during the process. When you're talking to the management team kind of the first time around is, let's say that you do get monthlies, and all the time we get monthly financials and we see the inventory number hasn't changed from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, or the accrued expenses hasn't changed from one time to the other. So one, obviously you got to look at those things, but then there's some other questions we might want to talk about, depending on the size of the company of, do they cycle count their inventory? Do they have a sense if the inventory numbers are close? Is that an important part of the process? So lots of times we'll kind of, you ask one little question about, hey, do you cycle count your inventory, which might not have a big impact on the inventory, but you start asking kind of an easy question like that, and you'll kind of learn a little bit more about whether you feel like you can trust their monthly internals, or their during the course of the year. And sometimes they're quarterly, and honestly those worry me even more, because it's like, I don't know, what were you doing for those other couple of months? Did you do any type of monthly close? So that's always a question. Another question that we like to ask is, do you feel like you have obsolete inventory? And frequently people will say no. Almost all the time they'll say no. And I'll kind of make a joke of like, oh, well, we value the company that, and I'll just kind of throw out a story about somebody with a ton of obsolete inventory. And almost every time they kind of like, well, we do have stuff that we just haven't written off yet. Or they'll start talking about those things. And we'll get there in a minute. But one of the things that's the problems to me with thinking about using our preferred method is, if somebody goes into the year with excess inventory or some type of excess or some type of obsolete, they're going to finish the year with it. And we might say, well, that looks normal. So those are, kind of a couple of the questions just early on that we like to ask. And then, another is, do you feel like you need, and, I have in here excess in quotes, excess inventory. And like my example of that is, we have a very high-end wire manufacturing company as a client, and they feel like they need to have, their competitive advantage is having this very high-end inventory in stock. So almost anytime they make a particular run of some kind of wire, they'll make a lot of it, and they'll have it sitting around sometimes for years and years. But they feel like when somebody like Boeing calls, they will get that business, and they can charge a higher margin by saying, yes, we have it, we can ship it out tomorrow. I look at that sometimes as an external analyst and say that feels excess. But if management feels like it should be there, um, it's tough to call that excess. So just a couple of those questions are questions we like to ask, and we don't normally ask those in writing. Sometimes we do, but we have kind of a little form for when we're talking to management, either in person or on the phone, kind of running through things early. We like to ask them a couple of those questions just to get them talking, but that helps dictate the answer on our working capital analysis. And then the last thing is we do like to ask if they're making adjustments during the month, during the course of the year, or not making adjustments, that they make it at year end. And the answer to that is always yes. But the real question is, are they material or not? And sometimes I've been on these webinars and, people go down a rabbit hole about how much is material, how much is different. That's got to be a facts and circumstances case, and it also depends on the purpose of the valuation. If we're talking about 20,000 on a $10 million valuation, or even 100,000 on a $10 million valuation, does that get lost in the average of the year or in a comparison? That's a judgment call that you have to make. But that's another good one that we like to ask of, just to get a sense of how good the financials are, especially on the smaller companies, maybe somebody that doesn't have audited financial statements. And I'll just tell you, I think from our experience, probably a third of our clients have audited statements, and then the other 2/3 have a mix of everything from reviewed to these god awful internal statements. Sometimes those are good. I shouldn't, I guess, make fun of those. But those are just questions we use to help us kind of decide on the methodology that drives a lot of it. So let's jump to the next slide here. And the CPE popped up on mine. So I'm going to answer as well. No,
I just launched the first poll question. Sorry that interrupted you.
No worries.
Reminder for the audience to respond to the poll questions for CPE, and you can feel free to continue, Brady. Sorry about that.
No worries. So these are kind of in order the methods we like to use. So we like to look at a 12-month average. There's one person in our firm that loves the 24-month average instead of just looking at the year. Likes to look at a 2-year average if we have that data. We'll also look at the working capital cycle, kind of looking at AR, inventory days, and also comparables. So let's just jump to the next slide. We'll look at this typical, and we only showed the 12-month average here. The 24-month would just be a very similar look. Essentially, what we're doing here is we'll take the 12 months and we'll just key in the balance sheets for those 12 months. And we typically are doing a cash-free, debt-free approach. So that's typically our approach. And a couple of people, interestingly enough, hit me over the weekend with questions about cash-specific, sort of excess cash. And I will get to that because that's a whole different, in my mind, issue it's obviously all tied together. But essentially what we like to do is show the full balance sheets for the 12-month, just the current assets and current liabilities. And first thing I'll tell you is lots of times we see people not show the debt in the during the course, the current debt during the course of the year, the month. But we like to back out the cash and the debt. And then other times there might be things in there that are separate components of value to us, things that are not really part of working capital. So we like to show it. We have a saying in our firm that things that we don't show, we typically end up making mistakes on. So we like to show the full balance sheet, highlight the items in blue that we're taking out, and then we get down to our core working capital, which we think of as AR, AP, accrued inventory, those types of things. And then we simply take where the company is at the valuation date or transaction date. As we think of it, we do try to think of it as a transaction as the valuation date, and then just look at that difference from what they've been carrying to the valuation date. And in this case, for this client, who interestingly enough has been a client of ours since before I joined Atlantic, it's on the third generation of management team since I got to Atlantic. Really nice group of people. And this is the methodology we use for their company, but we show them, their board likes to look at a couple of other metrics, and you'll be interested to see, we picked this company because of some of these differences, and the numbers are changed slightly to make it a little bit easier. But the last thing I just want to show is, you'll see this has insufficient working capital of about 150,000, but the target that's in there, we like to show the target as well to show how that fits into the rest of the analysis. So this is a negative 150 in terms of working capital. If you want to jump to the next slide. So the second way that we like to look at things is just a pure industry comparison. So we'll go out to something like RMA, which I'm not sure. I'd be curious if other people like some of the other data sets better. We've used RMA for forever, so we've kind of stuck to that. We've looked at some others, but essentially we'll look at a couple of the key ratios: the current ratio, the quick ratio, and sales to working capital. And the first thing that I will caution you about is, sometimes these industry selections are super broad, right? So your company fits in some narrow portion of a niche of a code, or it crosses a bunch of codes. So again, I've heard people say like, well, you've got to pull, the 6 codes and then probability weighted to whatever. And this goes back to me wondering, if they don't have anything else to do but this one client. So, we're trying to get the best 1, 2, or at most 3 codes. And it kind of, again, this helps drive part of the discussion. If there's public comparables, sometimes if it's shareholder dispute, if it's litigation, which we don't love litigation, we do some of it, but if there's public comparables, do you then also need to use the public company data, even though they're probably more diversified, they probably have other business units, that kind of thing. But, just looking at this, the first thing that I notice is, how different the methodologies are, just the different numbers, how different they are from each other. And then second, how different they were from the prior method, the kind of that 12-month look. And the first thing that jumps out at me is, because it's the quick ratio analysis is so different, is that there's something going on with the inventory. So this would start to prompt us to ask some questions of, why are you different from, we might ask this kind of couple of these questions, both at the management meeting, or we might ask in writing, kind of like, hey, it seems like your inventory is turning slow, or you're holding inventory. We might ask them to break it out from raw materials to WIP or something along those lines. But the second thing is, when we do this type of analysis with RMA, those are total current liabilities and total current assets. So this includes the cash and the short-term debt. So we can't just compare that 4.9 million that's popped up from the current ratio to our 12-month average. And in this case, there's about 1.1 million net of cash and working capital. So there's still a very significant difference between the 12-month look of what the company's actually doing versus this kind of industry comparison of the current ratio, quick ratio, and sales to working capital. I will say, for the first 10 years I was at Atlantic, this was the method we used. And I very specifically remember Our firm has also been passed from one generation to the other. Our firm was started in the late 60s, and the old man, as I very affectionately call him, who has since passed away, I would go in there and give him something with excess working capital, and he would say, "Where? Show me." And he's like, he's an old cranky guy, but he taught us all a lot. He'd say, like, "Show me. You telling me that these guys, this company, they want to collect their AR slow? They could collect it faster, but they're not, so they have excess, or they've got excess inventory that they could sell, but if somebody bought them, there'd be something different. Like, where is it? Show it to me." And he might agree that there's excess cash, but that was a tough sell with him. So that's also something I've never forgotten of. Where is it? Why is it? And so I'm going to jump to the next slide, and we'll kind of get into one of the other pieces here.
Brady, right now we have two questions that popped in. Do you want to
Sure.
answer those real quick? So I think the first one had to do with the last slide because it came up a little earlier. It says, what about the growing company? Average values from past 12 or 24 would not be representative. Just kind of a
100%. That's a great point. Great question. So this is a situation where, and this also happened during COVID, right? When the supply chain slowed down, the dollars in inventory was different from the quantity. Like suddenly the units people were holding at year end were very different from the dollars. Like if you have a construction supply type company, like those big sheets of plywood went from, I don't know, $6 a sheet to 60 or something like that in like days. So there's 100%, you got to be careful with that stuff. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit, that it cannot be like, none of this can be a black box. And I think for the first 5 years, maybe, or even more, that I was at Atlantic, I would kind of go to my manager, like it popped out a number, like, here it is. And, he or she would look at me like, well, what questions did you ask about this? Or what questions are we going to ask? And those are the types of things that make it really difficult. So in a situation, or if a company acquires somebody mid-year, and our largest client is a $1 billion company, and they bought a huge company, kind of like in late Q1, early Q2, and that company has a very different inventory cycle than the kind of the main company, kind of the acquirer. And we had always used this 12-month cycle. And I originally kind of said, like, well, it's almost a whole year. Let's just change it to kind of maybe 6 months. And on top of that, COVID was starting to hit, and it totally threw off our analysis. And we ended up going to a more cycle way of looking at it, which is a little bit more of what we're talking about here. But that's a great point.
Great, thank you. Let's see, for the other one, it says, good talk so far, Brady. Quick question, but why do you back out all of the cash and all of the debt from your NWC calculations rather than making some kind of assessment that at least some of the cash might be required in net working capital? Why do you not back out the surplus cash and the debt?
So again, that's a good question. So we do take out the debt, right? But the cash is a little different, and we have historically not added back the cash. I'm sorry, we've historically added back all the cash, and I'm gonna get back to that question in a minute, because that's one of the issues that we run into frequently, both in M&A deals, or if working capital is negative. If somebody has negative working capital because they're playing the bank, it sort of proves the point in my mind that you have to have some amount of cash on hand. And we see in lots of transactions, people buy, or acquirers buy, some amount of cash. And so they're taking debt to have some cash, which to me means that's really working capital. But I'll come back to that because I think that's a good point. That's why I love talking about this stuff. This is I don't know, this is the less esoteric stuff that I think is kind of gets down to the real world of valuing the companies.
Great, thank you, Brady.
So let's jump to the next slide. So we'll also look at both an industry analysis and a company analysis from looking at the days of receivables, the days of inventory, and the days of payable, and kind of look at total net expenses and what that working capital has to look like. And again, this is kind of the obvious one where something's going on with this company's inventory, right? The industry days of AR is one thing. They've slowed their payables down. In this case, I just happen to know they intentionally slowed theirs down. They hired a consultant that told them to slow it down, and they didn't lose any suppliers over this, but they had lots of grumbling that for the last 50 years they paid very, very quickly and were a really good corporate partner for a lot of people. And during COVID, people shipped to them first because they knew they'd get paid. And this changed a little bit, and it hurt some of their relationships. So that was another interesting thing that kind of like popped out from asking some questions about their growing days of payable. But clearly something's up with their inventory. And this again would just drive us to ask more and more questions. And in some cases, especially litigation, and again, typically I'm thinking of this on a control valuation. But even if we were doing a minority interest, we might still go with what's the company doing, and then we're going to apply a minority discount at the end. But let's not go too deep into that because we try to think about working capital of the balance sheet. It is what it is, and most of the time, we think that people are trying to collect their receivables as fast as they can. They're usually, not always, and usually trying to turn their inventory and not hold any more than they have to. Although there's some of those cases do come. But again, what's the industry? How good do we feel about the industry? And I'm sure like you, if you're doing a manufacturing company, you've probably have other manufacturing clients that maybe you can go look at their days of receivables or payables and do a little comparison if something's funky. Or if you've got public companies, I just find, I would say we do less than 25 valuations of companies over 100 million in value a year. And maybe those companies you can look at the publics, but I think it's really tough to compare a $5 million manufacturing company's working capital situation to, Lowe's or something along those lines. Sometimes we'll pull those metrics. I'm not saying that we don't, but I do think it's a tough comparison there. But we like to look at this. And again, the last piece here is we'll look at this kind of target working capital, how this looks as a percentage of sales, which will end up partially, coming into play with our whatever we choose. This will come into play with our income approach methods. So let's jump down and go through to the next slide. I forgot about that picture. This is just what I wanted to do was kind of talk through the cash issue that you mentioned, the debt issue. So Sandra, if you want to hit the next one. So some of the problems we have is there's tons of inconsistencies here. And at Atlantic, we do 100-ish valuations almost on an annual basis. So we'll do a manufacturing company every year for a number of years, and things change, right? So we get asked a lot of questions. If we don't stick to a methodology that's that can hold up over time, that causes problems. But somebody asked a question about why do we add back all the cash? We've historically done that, but there are lots of times now, and I'd say this is over the last 2, 3 years, we have started thinking more about, does a company need 2 weeks, 4 weeks? Is it 30 days? You can go to the cash cycle and sort of look at some of that stuff and say, okay, if working capital is going fine, if I were buying this company, would I want 2 weeks of payroll? Do I want two payrolls? That type of thing, of that amount of cash on hand. And the first place this pops up is, what if the company has negative working capital? And they've always had negative working capital. Well, clearly the company is playing the bank. So you can't just do our 12-month working capital that pops out, a number, and then add back the cash and subtract the debt. These are the types of things that where specifically we would then go to the cash and say, well, they got $1 million in cash, but they're funding working capital. And we would probably do a days of expenses, not probably, we would do a days of expenses, and then look at the cycle and say, okay, we think the company would want 30 days, 45 days, or a buyer would want 30 or 45 days of cash on hand to, if they were to buy this company. So that's probably what we would do. Again, going back to that cash question, which I think is a good point. Second, really have to look at the methodology and make sure that if you're doing cash-free, debt-free, that if you calculate your working capital one way, you're not, adding back the cash and including it in the working capital, or double counting it in such a way. That happens. I see that all the time on peer reviews that we do for people. And I do not want to go back 15 years of our own work because I'm sure if somebody pulled out one of ours from 10 years ago, they could probably find one where we might have done that. So that's a frequent area I see. The other is, and this happens internally, we go back and look sometimes, the days of AR, the days of AP in particular, we have a little formula in our model that just takes the AR, if you get the aging from somebody, and I just go right to the summary and, you key in the 30, 60, 90, maybe over 120, however they have it done. And we'll have the totals and have it not probability weighted, but weighted to say, okay, if the bulk of it is X number of days, sort of calculate out the weighted number of days in the AR. All the time, that doesn't match what our normal calculation of days of AR is. And that also starts to drive some questions of why are these two things different? And sometimes that has to do with pass-through revenue or other things. That's another important thing. It's a really quick check to do, and it doesn't take a lot of time. And it's once you do it once, it's like if you put it in your template, it auto populates. So let's we have 10 minutes, so let's jump to the next slide.
Oh, sorry. We have the poll question.
Go ahead.
We do have about 20 minutes, so we can go to the hour. So if you need more time.
Okay.
Thanks.
This is talk about this all day. No, I'm just kidding. So the pass-through revenue, this is where one of those things comes into play. We work with a lot of engineering firms, a lot of construction firms, and sometimes there's pass-through revenue that they actually take the AR and the AP on. And we have a CPA on staff that loves to point out the inconsistency of the revenue recognition when they don't have AR and AP associated with, with pass-through revenue. But that's just another kind of important thing to look at of, especially if you're using a sales to working capital percentage, just making sure that you think the industry is close enough that those comparable companies also have pass-through revenue or don't have pass-through revenue. in the calculation. And just a great example of that is the auto dealers. They will have income related to finance. In some of the publics, in some of the industry analysis, we see it's in other income. It's down almost below EBITDA, and in others, it's part of revenue. So just matching those up if it's a big enough number, just to make sure. And then the timing issues. The person that had raised the issue of the question before, if it's a growing company, or a declining company, if they've bought somebody, if COVID changed, the price of things, or the supply chain issues changed the pricing of things. Looking at those issues, we don't do it as much anymore, but asking about units. We do some valuations of some oil companies, like home heating delivery oil here. And so we'll ask a lot of gallon type questions, because those prices fluctuate all over the place. And it might be necessary to separate out that particular item. So that's just another issue. And the last here, I added the forecasted balance sheets. We don't have many clients that forecast balance sheets. We have a few, and they're all private equity backed companies. And very frequently, whatever those forecasted balance sheets have for the working capital targets doesn't jive with the past. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But we were in a litigation about 5 years ago, and it's like scarred in my mind from being cross-examined on it, of the inconsistencies of the forecasted working capital to what we were using to the target. It was like a triple whammy of me, not being comfortable. Unfortunately, this was internal preparation before we got to issuing the draft. It's a big enough company that we got to do that. So that's just one more thing. So let's jump to the next slide.
Brady, we have one more question. Do you have?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Question is, how do you handle construction companies that have multi-year contracts, cost in excess of billings, etc., with regard to the WC analysis?
So let's jump to the next slide. That's a great question, because number one, construction companies I don't know how much of the group does construction companies, but from one of our largest clients is one of the largest. It's a huge construction company, private, and they will flat out tell you they've been a client of ours forever. They have audited financials by one of the big four. They don't make that number up. I shouldn't say that, but they have a lot of sway over that cost in excess of billings and revenue number. And from talking to our small, clients, the normal sized, $10, $20 million companies, they totally make that number depending on how the rest of the year went. So we're very careful with that cost in excess of billings number. From sometimes we'll take those two numbers out of the asset and the liability out, depending on the situation or the purpose of the valuation. We'll usually ask some questions around that, because we want them to answer, why is it so far up or down? How is it, why is it so different from the prior years? But that is something we'll do sometimes. We'll separate that out as a number, to look at them on a net basis, compared to the revenue, compared to the past. So that's another one that's, I'll just say, is funky, and that sort of falls right into, again, with construction firms, retainage. So some companies have this big chunk of AR that they'll show on the balance sheet, but it won't show up necessarily on the AR aging, or it'll show up on the AR aging and it won't show up exactly in the AR balance. It'll show up someplace else in the balance sheet, and it might not be a short-term asset, that retainage or liability. Either way, That's another thing, especially with construction firms, and then some of those engineering firms that are pseudo construction, pseudo, um, um, they're like construction management type companies. That's another issue that you have to look out for. The multi-year contract, the hard part with the multi-year contracts is it depends if it's a kind of a one-time thing. We had an engineering firm a number of years ago. They got a huge, like 10-year EPA contract. So we almost didn't, I mean, I remember very specifically, we didn't know what to do with it, how to treat it, how it was impacting working capital, all those things. And then, like the next year they got another decent sized one, and they started overlapping. And some of those 10-year contracts are really single year contracts that could be cut off. But especially those construction firms that are doing big jobs that are going to last a couple of years, hopefully they overlap and it gets smoothed out a little bit, hopefully. But each one of those, again, it's like you can't treat it like a black box. And I think, I started this by saying, sometimes I feel like the presenters have unlimited hours to look at this. The working capital has become more time consuming for us, for sure. And we're looking for ways to pull time out of our analysis and pull pages out of our report, all those types of things. And it feels like every time we talk about working capital, we've got a new, like, oh, well, let's test this, drop this into the template. So it's not one of those easy things. And the only solace I can say is that I think everybody else is having the same issues. And so let's keep going here. I think there's just maybe one more. So, and you can drop to the next slide. I mean, at the end of the day, tying it together is the important thing. So if you have a target, working capital number, and that's 30% of sales or 10% of sales, but then in your capitalization of cash flow or your discounted cash flow, you're using you're using some other number, there's got to be a justification for that. We really like it to have it be the exact same number. If the target changed from last year to this year, we might take it, if we're valuing the company for, multiple years, we might take an average of the two. But that's just something to be careful of. And the other piece, and I think I've probably, talked about this too much, but is that that cash-free, debt-free thing of just making sure those are aligned, that you're not double counting or leaving something out from that perspective. But this, maybe the last thing I'll say, if there's questions or other things, is, over the last 20-ish years, the more people I've talked to about working capital, the more answers and questions I've had. And so I feel a little bit better that it's not just us. And, I'm talking about kind of the big shops that we've talked to, the big M&A people that we've talked to. Everybody kind of groans when you bring up working capital. And somebody told me recently that that's why in the letters of intent, it's always left to, we'll deal with working capital later, when we're at the very end of the process and people just, kind of will fight to agree to something. That if you try to agree to the working capital analysis before the LOI was signed, it might cause the deals not to be done. So that's it. I'm happy to talk questions, and also happy to talk about things after, kind of separately via email or what have you.
Great, thank you, Brady. Let's just see. I launched the last poll question. Let's just see if any questions come through. Just some last minute questions for you. But yeah, thanks for your time. That's a great presentation today.
No, thank you, everybody, and thanks very much for bearing with the technical difficulties at the beginning. It definitely
It
threw
happened.
me. So appreciate it.
Not a problem. Just right when it started, like you disappeared. I was like, wait, did it just end right when we started?
Right.
But
Perfect timing.
yeah, I don't see any questions coming through. Again, Brady, thank you for your time and thanks for the presentation. And yeah, our next webcast will be on June 26th. And yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. And we look forward to seeing everybody next month. All right.
Thanks.